I've spent the last 600 days in this cave building the ultimate create mod workshop, but it isn't even close to being finished yet. So over the next 100 days, I'm going to upgrade this cave even further and construct a massive chocolate factory that consists of chocolate bar production, multiple chocolate mixers, and 2 different farms harvested by their very own train. But I can't build the chocolate factory when there's no more space in the cave. So I grabbed some create blocks I had lying around to help speed up the process of clearing out a new area. I lit up the area I planned to clear out to make sure I wasn't in any danger of dying to something stupid like a rogue creeper sneaking up behind me, and then got rid of all the water and lava that would definitely cause me problems down the road. I cleared out a bit of space manually so I could put down the old train track placing contraption, and then started converting it into a makeshift tunnel bore. To quite literally nobody's surprise, I underestimated the number of blocks I needed to build the contraption, so I did have to make a few trips back and forth from the main area to eventually finish it off. Once it was fully assembled, I fueled up the furnace minecart and stood back to just watch it do its thing. I let it run for probably about 30 or 40 blocks before I picked it back up and reassembled it a few blocks over to repeat the same exact process. Because the tunnel bore was so thin, I had to repeat the process of placing down the rails, cart assembler, and cart contraption tons of times to fully clear out the area. Thankfully, once the cart was running, my job was fairly easy since I just kinda had to creepily follow behind it and maybe occasionally place down some torches. I even got pretty lucky one time and stumbled across some diamonds. It's no netherite, but it'll have to do. Once a sufficient space was cleared out, I went back to the main area and ditched all the random junk in my inventory. I spent some time working in JEI to map out all the items that I would need to make chocolate, and in the end, it seemed like it was really just sugar, cocoa beans, and milk. The only thing on that list I wasn't positive I had were cocoa beans, so I did a quick scan of my chest to see if I had any randomly lying around somewhere, and with my luck, I did not. I had yet to find a jungle biome while exploring, so I just restocked on food and took the elevator to the surface to wander around aimlessly until I managed to stumble across one. To save myself some time and a lot of walking, I just hopped on the train to the village and nearly made it all the way there before I was pretty abruptly stopped by a missing track, which kind of confused me since the track had been complete before, but I figured it probably just got carried away by an enderman or something and would fix it later. I set off in a random direction on my quest for cocoa beans, slaying anything in my path, but I realized pretty quickly that I should probably set a waypoint at the village to find my way home, so I did that before running off again. I made it to water as quickly as possible so I could hop on my fancy boat and move a little bit faster, and eventually I did up my render distance to that of a regular person so I could make better use of the enlarged minimap. I had to go back on land for the later portion of the trip, but after traveling nearly 2,000 blocks away from the village, I did manage to find a super tiny jungle biome. I made sure right out the gate to grab some bamboo and cocoa beans so I didn't forget them, and then I chopped down as many trees as possible since I'd need the jungle logs to plant the cocoa beans. After getting about 3.5 stacks of jungle logs, it was time for me to head home, so I just made a beeline for the village waypoint. I wanted to take the train back to the base because I was way too lazy to walk, so I shifted some tracks around to be able to turn the train around and head home. Once I was back down in the base, I sorted out my inventory and did some trading with the villagers to repair all my tools. I grabbed a bunch of sugarcane, cocoa beans, and dirt and went over to the newly cleared out area to start mapping out where both farms would be going. After a lot of placing and breaking of dirt, I had 2 relatively large rectangular areas for farming that most importantly were perfectly symmetrical. With the outlines of both farms ready to go, I started planning out the layout of the sugarcane farm. Initially, I tried to do the most optimal layout, but figured it was going to be way more of a pain than it was worth and just totally scrapped the idea. Next, I tried just doing a simple horizontal layout, but also had to scrap that idea when I found out the final row would be water instead of sugarcane, and that was just completely unacceptable. Thankfully, having the rows run perpendicular to the prior layout worked perfectly, with sugarcane bookending each side of the farm. To finish it off for the time being, I filled in all the water and placed down all the sugarcane that I had left in my inventory. With both farms having a lot of brown blocks in them, I wanted to see if I could include some moss in place of dirt somewhere to give the area some color. The only problem with this plan was my distinct lack of moss, so I finally did what you all recommended and bone mealed a few moss blocks on the ground and collected everything that got converted. After I finished collecting a decent chunk of moss, I placed down a few rows of it in place of dirt for the cocoa bean farm just to see how it would look. I tried mapping out how I wanted the rows of the farm to go, similar to what I did with the sugarcane farm, and to nobody's surprise, I ran into the exact same issue as before. My solution to this problem was just to expand the farms so the cocoa bean rows would work out exactly. I placed down a row of jungle logs and farmed a bunch of extra cocoa beans using the leftover bone meal that I had. I was about to expand the farm a little bit further when I noticed I was already running low on moss blocks yet again and decided it was finally time to put this issue behind me once and for all. I grabbed one of my 2 diamond hoes that apparently past me wasted a few diamonds on, enchanted planted it, and went into one of the old tunnel bore tunnels with a lot of bone meal. I bone mealed the moss straight through the tunnel and eventually turned back around to hack all of it up with my hoe in what honestly turned out to be a very satisfying massacre of moss. I repeated this process until my entire inventory was full of moss related blocks, and then I went back to the base to sort everything out. After dumping nearly 18 stacks of moss blocks into the storage room, I assumed I'd probably be set for a while. I took some of my newly farmed moss blocks down to the cocoa bean farm and finished filling in the ground with it. I placed down the rows of jungle logs following the plan I laid out earlier, and luckily I had over a stack of logs left over at the end. With the base for the cocoa bean farm done, I replaced all the dirt blocks in the sugarcane farm with moss blocks as well, and then spent the rest of that day and the next just harvesting and replanting both sugarcane and cocoa beans, trying to fill out both farms. While I waited for the last few pieces of sugarcane, I started building up with cobbled deep slate around the cocoa bean farm. It was definitely a super rough outline, but I did grab some train tracks anyway and tried to plan out a simple loop going around the farm so that a train could harvest them. I quickly realized my mistake since the train tracks can't have such harsh curves, so I took a step back and tried to think of a new option. I spent the next day doing pretty much the exact same thing, trying to find some way to get the small loop to work. After lots of trial and error, I managed to get a loop around just the cocoa bean farm, but I wasn't totally sold on how it looked since it was so close to the farm at the corners. I used the remainder of the day to fill in the rest of the area with cobbled deep slate to build the other train track loop. After filling in the entire floor, I actually got rid of the small train track loop since I knew the corners would continue bothering me, and instead I made one large track going around both farms. The track had to be a bit larger than expected and clipped into the wall at some points, but that would be an easy fix later on, so I left it and expanded both farms using the newly freed up area in the center of the loop. Even though it wasn't required, after expanding the farms, I changed the sugarcane farm's layout yet again to make it match the layout of the cocoa bean farm. While working on all of this, I realized the downfall of having one single train collecting both farms would be not being able to harvest the bottom layer of cocoa beans, so I attempted to raise the track by one block only around the sugarcane farm, but eventually gave up and reverted to change because, if I'm being honest, I'd rather have a less efficient but nicer looking farm. I used the entire next day to collect and craft the blocks needed to make the farming train. I managed to snag some leftover train blocks from the old storage area and then made 2 stacks of andesite casing. I used a fair bit of that andesite casing to craft the mechanical harvesters and then spent the rest of the day collecting various decorative blocks to try and build the body of the train. I took all the blocks down to the farms and put down a train station at the far wall to start assembling the train. I made 2 bogies and started building out the rough shape of the body of the train, but after a few design iterations, I was not loving the block palette that I picked. I went back up to the main area of the cave to get more styles of blocks to try building with, and on my way, I noticed the steam boilers had stopped running completely and had absolutely no fuel. Obviously, I immediately dropped what I was doing to troubleshoot the issue since multiple farms in the base rely solely on the steam boilers for power, and after checking the logs chest in the storage room, it seemed the tree farm was having some kind of malfunction. I ran over to the tree farm and quickly realized none of the items were being dropped off due to a clogged depot. It seemed like a pretty simple issue, so I just removed the moss carpet from the depot and immediately the system started working again. With a surplus of logs now coming back into the storage room, I ran back to jumpstart the steam boilers, and it took ages for me to get them working again. I had to disconnect a lot of moving parts, slowly fill one with water, manually fuel it, and then reconnect a few moving parts at a time until both were back up and running. Eventually, I did manage to get both boilers running at max speed again, and the only thing that was still damaged was my confidence. I went back down to the farms to finish working on the train and swapped out the item vaults for barrels since I felt like they better matched the theme of a farming train. I made some additional tweaks to the train body and put on spruce doors before gluing everything together to take it for a test drive. I had a bit of difficulty getting out of the train, but was able to reposition it from inside using my wrench and just got dropped back out of it. I got the train back on the train station, disassembled it, and added on a long line of mechanical harvesters on the front to harvest the top 2 layers of sugarcane. I did one very quick loop to check that the harvesters worked, and while there was a small area in the center of both farms that wasn't getting harvested, overall it was extremely satisfying. With the farming train now ready, I wanted to add a 3rd layer to the jungle logs to make use of both rows of harvesters for the cocoa bean farm, so I took a few of the jungle saplings I had to the surface to grow since I didn't have enough jungle logs left over. I spent the entire day chopping down small jungle trees and waiting for the leaves to despawn for saplings, and by the end of the day I managed to get 4 saplings to grow a giant jungle tree. After chopping down the entire tree and waiting for saplings from that one, I took my freshly gathered 2.5 stacks of jungle logs and went back down into the cave. I immediately took the jungle logs over to the cocoa bean farm and added a 3rd layer to each row. I harvested all the grown cocoa beans, and with how fast they grew, I had plenty left over to cover the entire 3rd row. I figured at this point both farms were pretty much done and went back to the old storage area to grab some bones, craft up some new train stations, and grab some leads since since I was in desperate need of help operating this heavy machinery. As the sun rose on a new day, I took the elevator up to the surface and used the entity tracker function on the minimap to quickly find a wolf, which I tamed and then brought back down into the cave. Once I was back at the train with the wolf, I used the lead trick to very easily get them on the seat rather than trying to somehow shove them through the door. I popped open a train schedule and started setting everything up, but I realized I wanted a train station on the other side of the farms too, so I could eventually load fuel into the train for blaze burners. I tossed one down opposite the main train station and finished setting up the train schedule before giving it to the wolf. After watching the train loop for a bit, I figured the timing was a little bit off and would need adjusting, but again, that was another thing that I planned to leave for later. While I was walking back to the main area, I checked on the steam boilers again just to be sure everything was okay, and was actually concerned to see the level of charcoal depleting again in the buffer chest. I took a trip over to the tree farm and noticed yet again a moss carpet had clogged up the depot. Initially, I had assumed it was a one-off occurrence, but since it seemed to be a repeating problem, I grabbed a smart chute, a filter, and some lava and set up a very basic garbage chute under one of the belts to just ditch any random items that would otherwise clog up the system. I sat back and watched the tree farm for a bit and left when I felt everything was working properly. The next day was dedicated to cleaning up the train tracks clipping into the wall that I claimed was an easy fix later on. It took me an entire day of mining, but I managed to clear all the deep slate that was in the way of the train, and it was only mildly annoying to have the deadly train driving around every 15 seconds or so. You may be wondering why I didn't just take the schedule to stop the train for a bit, and I'm also wondering that now too. After finishing off both farms, it was finally time to unload everything from the train, so I ran over to the old storage area, crafted a portable storage interface, and grabbed a piston along with some piston extension poles. The last piece I needed was a train observer to signal the train arriving, but as expected, I had no train casing left to make one. I snagged some extra buckets and ran over to the lava generator to make some obsidian. Once I had 16 pieces of obsidian, I ran down to the ore processing setup and converted them into powdered obsidian. Usually whenever I do this, I get super unlucky with my obsidian surviving the process, but this time I actually got really lucky and got over a stack of powdered obsidian. I put the powdered obsidian on the depot to be filled by the lava spout, and then I took multiple trips back and forth to bring batches of the unprocessed obsidian sheets up to the mechanical press. Because the sheets don't stack until they're fully processed, it was definitely a huge pain to make so many, but the depot honestly looked hilarious with the sheets flying off it as it overflowed, and after this I would definitely be set on obsidian sheets for a very long time. Once all the sheets were processed, I placed down a stack of logs, stripped all of them, converted each into brass casing, and then finally converted probably about a third into train casing. I used my newly crafted train casing to make 2 train observers, and then collected the other create blocks I was going to need from around the base. With my inventory full and ready to go, I went back over to the farms and stole the train schedule from the wolf so I could get to work. While the train was stopped, I took the opportunity to disassemble it and add on 4 more mechanical harvesters so I could stop ripping my hair out every time it missed the middle sugarcane and cocoa beans. I gave the train schedule back to the wolf, and right after the train left, I placed down the train observer and put a redstone link on it to signal when the train arrived. I went up the wall to clear out an area that was roughly the same height as the train, and then put down a sticky piston with a portable storage interface and barrel that would extend when the train arrived to collect everything. I dug out a small area below the piston and set up a basic water wheel to power it, and while it worked fine, I pretty quickly saw that the piston was extending 1 block too far. Once I got the piston to extend the correct length, I hooked up a redstone link onto a gear shift, but had to flip the rotation using a random gearbox since it was extending the piston when the train wasn't at the station. Everything was working perfectly, except for the fact I couldn't figure out why no items were coming out of the train. I quickly realized my mistake since I had nothing actively pulling items out of the interface, so I slapped down a brass funnel to eject items onto a belt running alongside the piston. I put a barrel on the back of the belt with another brass funnel leading into it, and then glued everything together. It definitely took a few attempts before I got the belt extending with the piston correctly, and on top of that, getting the rotational power in the correct direction after it extended. But eventually, items were in fact being pulled from the train and input into the barrel, and most importantly, it looked super cool. I took a short break from working on the unloading area to sort out my mess of an inventory, but quickly returned to try and speed up the system since it was a bit too slow for my liking. I redid the entire water wheel area so I could use a bubble column in the back of the water wheel and cog wheels to gear the RPM up to 40, but that small improvement then led me down a rabbit hole of trying to redesign the entire thing. After tearing down nearly the entire unloading area and reassembling it to try for some weird vertical design that I thought would look cool, I returned back to my original setup with the newly improved rotational speed. Since I was determined to improve the unloading area further, I cleared out more space in the back and put down a large item vault in place of the barrel to store everything. I glued everything together, but the minute the train came around to unload, I realized the problem with having a stationary storage system and an extending item transport. I fixed this issue by extending the belt far beyond the item vault, which actually worked out pretty well because the disgustingness of it was hidden by the back wall anyway. Once the upgrades were done, I sat back and watched everything run for a while just to make sure there weren't any issues, and to my amazement, it did seem to be working pretty well. The next day was a crafting day since I needed mechanical mixers, and unfortunately those were one of the few blocks that was not included in the auto crafting room. I ended up making a bunch of andesite alloys since I was running low already, and after letting that process for a bit, I crafted 3 depots, mechanical mixers, and basin. Like usual, I filled up the rest of my inventory with random create blocks that I may or may not have needed and went back to the unloading area. I cleared out a bit more space on the other side of the item vault and slapped down 3 depots with brass funnels so the items could be output. While I was working, I realized I completely spaced out. It would need to process the sugarcane into sugar to use it, so I crafted 3 millstone and put them next to the depots. I also put down the basin and mechanical mixers in the same area since I wanted to try for at least a semi-clean looking processing area for the chocolate that would all be operated by a couple mechanical arms. After giving it a bit more thought, I went over to the mechanical crafters and crafted up 2 crushing wheels to use in place of the millstones. I took them back to the unloading area and tore up everything I had just placed down along with an additional layer of deep slate. I put down 3 belts coming from the item vault with brass funnels ejecting onto them and put the crushing wheels over the furthest back belt with another belt over it to drop in the sugarcane. I finished off the setup by putting down barrels at the end of each belt with brass funnels going in one side and then out the other side onto depots. I put the basin across from the output depots with mixers over each one and blaze burners under each one. I ran some fluid pipes off the back of the basin to eventually pull the chocolate out and put mechanical arms down in between the depot and basin just as placeholders for the time being. I spent the rest of the day pressing copper into sheets and then using it to craft fluid tanks to eventually store the massive amount of chocolate I was going to generate inside. I took the newly crafted fluid tanks over to the unloading area and made a tall 3x3 tank right next to the mixing area. Since that was the last major component of the factory, I figured it would be a good time to think about decorating a bit, so I went back to the base to craft and collect everything I would need to automate the production of packed mud. I figured it's a brown block I've never used before, so it probably would be good to use it with the chocolate production. I started out by placing down a basin and a mixer a little ways away from the rest of the unloading area, and then put down a pump and some fluid pipes leading to an infinite water source. I dug a small area out behind the mixing setup and put down a rotation speed controller with some water wheels to power the mixer and eventually the water pump. After that, all I had to do was toss some dirt in and let the mixer do its thing. While the mixer was running, I went over to the wheat farm and diverted the wheat to go into a chest instead of being processed into bread, so I could use it to later turn the mud into packed mud. I grabbed some bone meal and went to town on the wheat to help speed up the process just a little bit. I took the freshly gathered stack of wheat over to the mud mixer and tossed it in with the also freshly mixed mud, and yet again sat back to let the mixer spin away to its heart's content. Once it finished processing the stack of packed mud, I grabbed it out and refilled the basin before heading back to the storage area to spend the rest of the day collecting more decorative blocks. I spent the next 4 days decorating the entire unloading and mixing area. I started out by mapping out where I wanted the elevated area covering the piston setup to be with spruce logs and mirrored the entire rotational power setup so it would be easier to hide. I did a quick comparison between oak wood and spruce wood for the flooring and ended up just going with spruce. I only did part of the flooring since the mud mixing setup was kinda in the way and had to adjust the rotational power setup yet again after I noticed it was pulling items out of the vault, which is definitely not what I wanted it to do. I finished outlining the lower area with deep slate tiles and cut the fluid tank down to a 2x2 so it would sit in the middle of the wall and stop bothering me. I added some moss and normal deep slate to the floor and then pushed the far wall back 1 block to add in spruce log support beams around the entire area. Once I had the support beams in place, I cleared out 2 small rooms behind the setup to eventually hold water wheels for power and then filled them in with deep slate bricks for walls and andesite for flooring. With the general layout of the area done, I wanted to work on some small details and started out by lowering the fluid tank pretty drastically and adding in a second one directly next to it. The new height of the fluid tank let me run the spruce logs around it and blend it in with the rest of the wall. I also finished off both back rooms by putting water wheels in the right one and covering the ceiling with deep slate and moss. I ended up using water for both sets of water wheels for the time being, but planned in the future to use chocolate instead. I used the next day to head to the surface and track down some cows. I didn't have to go too far and managed to snag 2 with leads and brought them back over to the elevator. I got one in the elevator and just tied the other one to the sheep pen before hopping in the already cramped elevator for a trip down to the base. Once the first cow was in the base, I slowly led her over to the unloading area and tied her to a fence while I figured out how the heck I even wanted to automate everything. The next 4 days were strictly about automating the production of milk. I tore up all the water wheels from the second back room and replaced them with an item drain, 2 depots, and a deployer. I tore the setup down multiple times because I kept thinking to myself that it would look better 1 block further to the left or 1 block further back, but eventually I got it down and made it into a loop using brass funnels and a hopper. I milked the cow and finished setting the filters so the bucket would milk the cow and then loop around to be drained and used again. With the setup done, I led the cow over, trapped them in front of the deployer, and used a hand crank to test that everything worked. Everything worked flawlessly, and I quickly hooked up a small fluid tank in the wall to the item drain to act like a buffer for the milk before using fluid pipes to also run the milk into the basin. I definitely struggled a lot trying to figure out how I wanted to pump the milk into the basin since I was honestly running out of usable sides for each of them, but got a relatively clean setup with it going in the front and just called it there. I noticed I was running low on soul sand, so I slapped on my gold helmet and took a trip to the nether to collect some. It took me a little bit to find some, but I ended up getting over a stack of soul sand from inside my usual tunnel to the nether fortress before returning to the portal to go home. Unfortunately, I still got dropped off at the randomly generated portal on the surface instead of the one I made, which meant I had to call the elevator up to get me and ride it all the way back down into the base. With my refreshed supply of soul sand, I put down 5 water wheels with bubble columns in the first back room and hooked them up to a rotation speed controller to power the entire factory. I spent the next 2 days making the most disgusting mess of rotational power I have ever done in an attempt to get all the belts and crushing wheels spinning in the correct directions. At the end of the second day, I managed to get everything running in the correct direction using the largest mass of gearboxes I have ever seen and just quickly covered up the wall in hopes I would never have to touch it again. Unfortunately, I wasn't even close to being done with hooking up the rotational power to the entire system and spent another 3 days running power behind the walls to the cow milker, the pumps, the mixers, and the mechanical arms. It definitely wasn't pretty, and I tore down and rebuilt the piping network more times than I can even count, but eventually I did manage to get everything hooked up and spinning. After powering everything, I noticed items weren't making it off the belt into the crushing wheel, so I added in a chute with a brass funnel pushing items into it so the sugarcane would actually drop straight down and be processed. I set all the empty filters for the system and cranked up the rotational speed controller to 32 RPM so the mixers would start making some chocolate. Once the first batch of chocolate was done, I reconnected the rotational power to the chocolate pump and the fluid tank started filling. Unfortunately, the system did run into a problem pretty quickly since it attempted to pump out the milk instead of the chocolate and the pipe broke. So I crafted 3 smart fluid pipes and put them at each basin to only pull out chocolate. With the system now running, I took a small break from technical create stuff to do the menial task of clearing out the junk from the unloading area. I tore down the entire mixing setup that I had used to make mud and finished placing nearly the entire flooring for the area. I moved all the items from the chests on the ground and got rid of them so I could finally finish off the soon-to-be fancy deck covering the unloading area. While I was working, I noticed the chocolate fluid tank had already filled up, so I got rid of the water powering the water wheels and started replacing it with chocolate. I pretty quickly realized my mistake since the system stopped running altogether and I no longer had a way to get chocolate into buckets to get the water wheels going again. So I built a super scuffed hand crank and spout setup in the back to fill 1 bucket at a time. I took multiple trips back and forth to fill in the chocolate wheels, and right as the last wheel was being covered, the system started running again. Unfortunately, nothing can go perfectly, and when I tore down the spout setup and reconnected the chocolate pump, the system overstressed due to the chocolate wheels generating slightly less stress capacity than the water wheels using bubble columns. This was obviously a pretty huge issue, so I spent the entire next day trying to fix the rotational power. The first problem I tackled was the unloading belt spinning in the wrong direction when it retracted and spitting items all over the ground. Thankfully, this was a pretty simple fix using encased chain drives in place of gearboxes to avoid the shaft from being given incorrect rotational power whenever it was retracted. The second problem was a little bit harder to fix, and after a few different attempts to free up some stress capacity for the chocolate pump, I decided the easiest option was just to gear down the rotational power going directly into that pump. After seeing how cool the flowing chocolate looked, I wanted to use more of it around the area, so I collected a bunch of decorative blocks that I thought would match the color at least semi-decently. I reattached the spout to the fluid pipes and filled a bunch of buckets with chocolate so I could fulfill my lifelong dream of being the scuffed Minecraft version of Willy Wonka. I dug out some space under the spruce flooring and placed down a few buckets of chocolate to make a small chocolate river that would flow down next to the train tracks. I replaced the blocks around the base of the chocolate river with dirt, granite, packed mud, and moss to try to blend in the brown color of the chocolate with the harsh color of the deep slate. On top of this, I added in a few additional pools and waterfalls of chocolate so nothing looked too out of place, and used the same block palette around those to try and expand my now overly common building style. I did decide to eventually get rid of the moss, so it was only different brown blocks around the chocolate, and I still had mixed feelings on the design, but I was stepping out of my building comfort zone, and that was good enough for me at this point. With the small chocolate river now complete, I was ready for a little bit of a bigger challenge, so I went to the other side of the farms and spent nearly the entire day building up the wall next to the chocolate fluid tanks. Once I got all the way up to the ceiling, I placed down a few buckets of chocolate to make the biggest chocolate waterfall yet. Once the large waterfall was done, I repeated the same process I had done with the other side and made a few small pools and waterfalls here and there, and then replaced the walls around them with a similar brown block palette. Eventually, I ran to the other side of the base just to see how everything looked from afar, and I thought it actually turned out pretty good. At this point, I was pretty happy with how all the different chocolate waterfalls were looking, so I used the next few days to spruce up the unloading and mixing area just a little bit more. To keep everything evenly spaced out, I shaved off the far side of the spruce flooring and built up the deep slate wall in its place. I went back to the main base to gather some additional decorative blocks like lanterns and chains and returned to the new area to finish it off. In my typical fashion, I placed down lots of barrels with lanterns and other lanterns on chains hanging from the ceiling. I even continued using the moss carpet trick and put it over torches to light the entire space in a relatively inconspicuous way. I finished off everything by planting lots of different flowers and pots all over the place and growing some glowberries from the moss on the ceiling. After all the decorating was done, I moved the chests that were on top of the spruce flooring slightly off to the side to start clearing out some room for the elevator. I made a quick run back to the main base to craft up a few random blocks I would need for both the rope pulley setup and the elevator decoration, and when I got back, I cleared out the 3x3 area the elevator would travel up. Due to my lack of creativity, I pretty much just copied the elevator design I had already made since the block palette matched perfectly, and then I glued everything together before heading up to the top of the wall and placing down the rope pulley. I ran shafts and gearboxes from the rope pulley into the wall and put down a gear shift connected to a water wheel to power the elevator. I connected everything, and the rope pulley did start lowering to attach to the elevator, but it was also going super duper slow, so I broke and replaced the water wheel and put it with additional cog wheels to gear up the speed to 40 RPM. This change did increase the speed, but it also reversed the direction of rotational power, so I took the chance to build a platform of deep slate around it. Once the platform was done, I set up the redstone to control the elevator going up and down and put a button at both stops. Both the redstone and button at the top of the elevator were kind of a little bit ugly, so I used deep slate and moss to build up the wall around them and blend everything in with the existing terrain. Unfortunately, I was still standing on a completely floating deep slate platform, so I started building up from the bottom of it to try to make it stand out a little bit less and connect it with the walls around it. I spent the next 2 days covering majority of the elevator shaft with deep slate and moss so it didn't stand out so much. I had to do a lot of moving around as it was kind of an awkward project to work on, but the moss came in handy as scaffolding. If only a real scaffolding block existed in the game. After I finished working on the area, I tore down the moss scaffolding and brought the elevator down to redesign the bottom of the elevator shaft. I outlined the elevator with spruce logs and moved the button closer to the elevator before covering up the redstone behind it with more deep slate. I continued working on the elevator drop-off area and added in similar details as I had with the mixing area. I placed down lots of barrels and lanterns and added in glowberries and flowers to brighten up the area. In the end, majority of the item vault was covered up with random blocks, and the entire space seemed to flow together really nicely, so I was really happy with how it turned out. After looking around, I wanted to add more moving parts to the area just to make it a little bit cooler, and decided that chocolate bar production would fit that goal pretty well. I collected a bunch of create blocks like the mechanical press and basin, which are pretty critical to the process of making chocolate bars, and started trying to map out where I wanted them to go next to the elevator. I was really indecisive, as per usual, and tried tons of combinations of where to put each part, but in the end, I figured one just wasn't going to be enough, and I'd probably need at least 3 to really make it perfect. I took the elevator up to get more mechanical press and basin, and when I came back, I placed down a belt a few blocks back into the wall. I put all 3 basin in a row, ejecting out the back onto the belt, and put a mechanical press over each one. I put a single barrel down with a hopper feeding into it and a brass funnel pushing from the belt into that. I wanted both sides of the basin to be be bookended by barrels, so the scuffed hopper setup allowed me to do that, and I just covered the mess up with deep slate. I ran a really long fluid pipe all the way from the basin to the chocolate fluid tank, and then put down a few water wheels behind the basin to power the belt and mechanical press. After I got everything hooked up and running, I did notice that no chocolate was coming into the basin, so I hooked up 2 additional pumps along the pipe and ran power to both of them from the new water wheels. The chocolate finally made its way to the basin, and the press started making chocolate bars, so I took the chance to go and get rid of the second chocolate fluid tank now that I was draining the chocolate buffer and turning it into bars for storage. I spent the rest of the day, along with the next day, hauling inventory after inventory after inventory of random blocks from the chests that I kept moving around to the storage area. At the end of the second day, I was finally able to get rid of both double chests that had been clogging up the area for way too long. I wanted to make sure the system wouldn't run into any issues after running for extended periods of time, so I sat back and watched the mixers run for majority of the next day. Don't get confused, it definitely wasn't because I was feeling lazy or because I was eating pizza while playing and accidentally got grease all over my keyboard. If that was the case, it would be very, very sad. After verifying the system worked for extended periods of time pretty flawlessly and finishing my pepperoni pizza, I went over to the villagers and did as much trading as possible to both repair my tools and, more importantly, get tons and tons of emeralds. I grabbed all the emeralds I already had, and combined with my newly acquired ones, I made over 1.5 stacks of emerald blocks. I knew it wouldn't be nearly enough to make a full emerald beacon, but I wanted to see how the green looked, so I tore up the outer layer of gold on the existing beacon and replaced it with emerald blocks. Right away, I was not a huge fan of how the green looked, mainly because of the block texture and not so much the color, so I switched the beacon back to gold, but set it to give speed too this time. Since I was nearing the end of the 100 days, I didn't want to start a new big project, and instead collected the blocks I'd need to finally make a dump chest for the storage room. I dug down behind the stone cutter in the storage room, and then dug a long path over to the main belt line feeding into the sorting system. I messed with a few overly complicated cogwheel and gearbox setups to get the rotational power from the main belt to the new belt, and eventually settled on a very simple 2 cogwheel setup. I connected the new belt and put a brass funnel ejecting from the new belt onto the main belt line to carry the items back through the system. I ran belts all the way back through the tunnel and transferred rotational power from each belt to the next one using a few gearboxes. I put down a barrel at the end of the last belt and put a smart chute below that so entire item stacks could drop on the belt system at once instead of just 16. I used the next day to clean out all the junk in the overflow chest at the end of the storage system belt line, along with a bunch of the random stuff from the old storage area that had just been sitting there collecting dust. It was definitely a whole lot easier to just toss everything into one barrel and let the automated system do the rest. While I was working, I had noticed that not having haste from the beacon anymore felt pretty bad, but also having speed was pretty nice, so I grabbed my gold helmet and went into the nether to farm some wither skeleton skulls. I got super lucky, and the first wither skeleton I killed after getting to the fortress dropped me a skull. Normally, this would be super odd for me, but not this time, because in that same day, I managed to get another 2 wither skulls and was already ready to go home and fight the wither. I was feeling good though, and figured the hot streak would keep going, so I spent the next 2 days continuing to kill wither skeletons. While I was waiting for more to spawn, I took the opportunity to start clearing out space in the nether fortress to try to increase spawn rates. The lava that would randomly spill out everywhere was a bit of a pain to deal with, but after having some wither skeletons spawn in the open area, it was pretty much worth it. Unfortunately, my luck turned after I got greedy, and I only managed to get 1 more wither skull over the 2 days before heading home. After I got back to the base, I dumped all the junk I got into the garbage chest, and then swapped out my basically dead gold helmet at this point for my fancy beefcake of a netherite helmet. I grabbed some soul sand along with the leftover strength potion I had, and went down into the tunnel bore tunnels to fight the wither. I dug out a tunnel for the fight and stumbled across some diamonds while doing so, which was good because it was probably more exciting than the actual wither fight. I summoned the wither and cheesed the fight with the bow until phase 2, and then just slapped him in the face until they graciously gave me the nether star. And with that, it was day 700. Another 100 days were done, and this time I managed to make a massive chocolate factory. Let me know in the comments what you guys thought of the build, and if you want to see 800 days next. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe if you guys enjoyed the video.